Hi, I'm Tom Linsky. I was reading through the book again recently, and I realized it would be kind of fun to read it to you guys, chapter by chapter, in as pretentious a manner as possible, while breaking the book down and kind of comparing it fact versus fiction, and seeing how similarly it does stack up against the true story of the Titanic. I'm not going to express any opinions as to whether or not the book was prophetic in any way, but I will go through, read it in full to you, and I will pause and add some commentary throughout. So, without any further ado, I will read to you the oldest copy of the book that I own, which is 1994. This one is by Buccaneer Books. So, The Wreck of the Titan, or Futility, by Morgan Robertson, originally published in 1898, and then again in 1912, just immediately after the Titanic disaster, to kind of capitalize on the similarities, and then this copy was printed in 1994. The Wreck of the Titan, Chapter 1. She was the largest craft afloat, and the greatest of the works of men. In her construction and maintenance were involved every science, profession, and trade known to civilization. On her bridge were officers who, besides being the pick of the Royal Navy, had passed rigid examinations in all studies that pertain to the winds, tides, currents, and geography of the sea. And they were not only seamen, but scientists. The same professional standard applied to the personnel of the engine room, and the steward's department was equal to that of a first-class hotel. So this is very similar to the Titanic, but to be fair, very similar to most other ships of the time that carried the prestige of the Titanic. So the Olympic, the Lusitania, the Mauretania, the Aquitania. 2 brass bands, 2 orchestras, and a theatrical company entertained the passengers during waking hours. A corps of physicians attended to the temporal, and a corps of chaplains to the spiritual welfare of all on board, while a well-drilled fire company soothed the fears of nervous ones and added to the general entertainment by daily practice with their apparatus. Now, you see, this is sounding more to me like the Great Eastern than the Titanic or any ship of 1912. And the Great Eastern, of course, was built in 1858, 1859, and was sailing in the 1860s. So 30-some years before this book actually came out. So the idea of this book being so far-fetched about a ship that is so above and beyond the standards, it really isn't so far. Titanic had no brass bands. It did have 2 orchestras, although we often combine it into one orchestra when telling the story. No theatrical company. But the Great Eastern did have all of these additional luxuries, and as the Great Eastern kind of fizzled from history, people realized you just don't need it on a ship. It's too much. You're only on board for a week or 2 weeks at a time, and people enjoyed each other's company, or books, or wandering about. There was no need for all this excessive cost on the shipping company. From her lofty bridge ran hidden telegraph lines to the bow, stern engine room, crow's nest on the foremast, and to all parts of the ship where work was done, each wire terminating in a marked dial with a movable indicator, containing in its scope every order and answer required in handling the massive hulk, either at the dock or at sea, which eliminated to a great extent the hoarse, nerve-wracking shouts of officers and sailors. So, of course, this is the telegraph thing we see on the bridge of the Titanic and other ships. And, of course, we see them very commonly in 1910, 1912. But, again, those were on the Oceanic and the Atlantic in 1871. So the telegraphs on the bridge communicating with every other part of the ship that moves it forward and deals with the operation is not new. It's not even new in 1898. From the bridge, engine room, and a dozen places on her deck, the 92 doors of 19 watertight compartments could be closed in half a minute by turning a lever. Again, not a new innovation. These were on German liners at the time period of this book. These doors would also close automatically in the presence of water, not new for the Titanic. With 9 compartments flooded, the ship would still float, and as no accident of the sea could possibly fill this many, the steamship Titan was considered practically unsinkable. Okay. Practically, okay, that's creepy. Not gonna lie, that is a little bit creepy. Although, how could you have 9 compartments flooded in the ship and still be okay? I don't know. There's no imagery of what this ship actually looked like because it's fictional, so a lot of people have speculated, but it doesn't make much sense. Built of steel throughout and for passenger traffic only, she carried no combustible cargo to threaten her destruction by fire, and the immunity from the demand for cargo space had enabled her designers to discard the flat kettle bottom of cargo boats and give her the sharp dead rise or slant from the keel of a steam yacht. And this improved her behavior in a seaway. She was 800 feet long, of 70,000 tons displacement, 75,000 horsepower, and on her trial trip had steamed at a rate of 25 knots an hour over the bottom, in the face of unconsiderable winds, tides, and currents. Okay, so pause for a moment. Let's break this down a little bit here. Okay, well, first off, she has no cargo hold. Titanic had a massive cargo hold, and in fact made a lot of her money from the cargo. But let's just go over the proportions of this ship, shall we? 800 feet long. Okay, so she's actually shorter than the Titanic. But 70,000 tons displacement. She's almost twice the weight of the Titanic. That is one fat girl. What is going on? How do you get that fat? How are you that heavy? And then, oh wow, look at that. Look at that. On her trial trip, she did 25 knots an hour. But you have 75,000 horsepower. Come on, Titanic didn't have that many horsepower, and 25 was about her top speed too. This is not an impressive ship. It's really fat. It's kind of like stubby. And, well, alright, 1898, 25 knots is pretty impressive. And she is one heavy girl, but come on. She's not that well designed. But the author makes her sound well designed. And when telling a story, that's all that matters. Where was I? Okay. In short, she was a floating city. Okay, yeah, but they've been saying that since before the Titanic. I think floating city came about with the Great Eastern. Containing within her steel walls all the tends to minimize the dangers and discomforts of the Atlantic voyage, all that makes life enjoyable. Unsinkable, indestructible, she carried as few boats as would satisfy the laws. These 24 in number were securely covered and lashed down to their chocks on the upper deck, and if launched would hold 500 people. Those are tiny boats. Those are really small boats. Titanic had 20 lifeboats and could fit 1,200 people. So, these are tiny boats. She carried no useless, cumbersome life rafts, but because the law required it, each of the 3,000 berths in the passengers, officers, and crew's quarters contained a cork jacket, while about 20 circular life buoys were strewn along the rails. Okay, well, every ship required life jackets, so... Except I don't understand that. The regulations for a ship of that size at that time period was 16 lifeboats. The same regulations applied to Titanic in 1912. I think he just got the regulations wrong. The regulations are not calling for 24. Although it is an American author, perhaps the United States demanded a different amount. I don't know. In view of her absolute superiority to other craft, a rule of navigation thoroughly believed in by some captains, but not yet openly followed, was announced by the steamship company to apply to the Titan. She would steam at full speed in fog, storm, and sunshine, and on the northern lane route, winter and summer, for the following good and substantial reasons. First, that if another craft should strike her, the force of the impact would be distributed over a larger area if the Titan had full headway. and the brunt of the damage would be borne by the other. Oh man, what a scummy outlook by that company. So essentially their reasoning is, well, she's going to go full speed anyway because, well, it's not going to hurt us, it'll just hurt the other ship. Second, that if the Titan was the aggressor, she would certainly destroy that other craft, even at half speed, and perhaps damage her own bows, while at full speed she would cut her in two, and no more damage to herself than a paintbrush could remedy. In either case, as the lesser of two evils, it was best that the smaller hull should suffer. A third reason was that at full speed she could be more easily steered out of danger, and a fourth, that in case of an end-on collision with an iceberg, the only thing afloat that she could not conquer. Her bows would be crushed in but a few feet further at full than half speed, and at the most 3 compartments would be flooded, which would not matter with 6 more to spare. Okay. Don't get me started on head-on collision with an iceberg, because that's just not going to work. But we are dealing with fiction here, so okay. So it was confidently expected that when her engines had limbered themselves, the steamship Titan would land her passengers 3,000 miles away with the promptitude and regularity of a railway train. She had beaten all records on her maiden voyage, but up to the 3rd return trip had not lowered the time between Sandy Hook and Daunt's Rock to the 5-day limit, and it was unofficially rumored among the 2,000 passengers who had embarked at New York that an effort would now be made to do so. Okay, so unlike the Titanic, the Titan is actually able to break all speed records. Titanic was unable to. She was significantly slower than some of the other ships of the time, such as the Lusitania, which I believe she did hold the record, or maybe it was the Mauretania. But Titanic had no chance of competing, so she never really was speeding. Her only shot at beating a record, which you sometimes hear about the Titanic making a record voyage, was beating her sister ship Olympic's record. And we should also note here that the Titan is traveling the reverse route of the Titanic, and not the same exact route, going from New York to England as opposed to England to New York, such as with the Titanic. Oh, well, that's the end of the chapter. So, I've read this book before, and that chapter is really just an introduction to the ship. And from here on, we're going to get into more personal stories with some of the people on board. And but so far, I would say that there are similarities. There's no getting around that. There are some very interesting similarities. I mean, come on, right there. The name of the ship, the Titan, and the Titanic. And of course, being called practically unsinkable, the rough dimensions of the ship. But there's also some very significant differences. She is not as... She has more appointments than the Titanic does in terms of entertainment staff. And she is much heavier. She's one heavy lady. So that is it. Chapter 1 of Wreck of the Titan.